this is not intended to be a history of the B-24 itself, more this specific airplane, but there was 18,000 of these airplanes built, a little over 18,000. And where Diamond Lil came from is there was 20 B-24As, the very early models that the Army Air Corps had slated for themselves. They were diverted to the French because the French needed bombers, and this was in early 1940. Well, then the French got overran by the Germans, and the Royal Air Force took that order of 20 airplanes. So literally what they did was these airplanes that were on the production line in various stages of completion. You can see in the picture, a lot of it was done outdoors on the ramp there at San Diego. Diamond Lil is one of those airplanes. I just can't tell exactly which one. But these airplanes were basically converted for British use. And what they did was they just took a slot of serial numbers that were going to be for the American airplanes, pulled those serial numbers away, and the RAF assigned British serial numbers to those airplanes. The real serial number that Diamond Lil would have been had it never gone to the RAF, it would have been 40-2366. That serial number was pulled off the airplane before it was really underway, to be honest. That number was thrown back into the pot. And several years later, there was, or not several years later, a few months later, there was a B-24D that rolled off the assembly line with that serial number 2366. That airplane survived the war as a trainer and ended up being scrapped in Altus, Oklahoma, like in 1945 at a salvage yard. So that's why the serial number 402366 doesn't appear on this airplane. Had it stayed with the U.S., that's what it would have been. Next slide. You can see the short nose on the airplane. This is a hallmark of the early model B-24s, the A models, and the LB-30Bs. You can see in the back, you see there's a tarp that's covering the top of the airplane. You'll see here in a minute that covers where the gun tub used to be. So next slide. This is what the airplane looked like. This is not Diamond Lil. I think this is AM-929. Diamond Lil is AM-927. This is what the airplane looked like when it rolled off the factory. It was accepted by the British on May 17th of 1941. We have the signed receipt where the British signed for the airplane. It's a common misconception that the RAF never accepted it. That is just not true. The RAF did, the British Aircraft Commission, the Purchasing Commission, did buy and pay for the airplane, and we have the paperwork. But this is what it would have looked like. Next slide. Had we not sold it to the British, this is what the airplane would have looked like in American service. The neutrality flag were only on certain airplanes, but that is an A model B-24. And if you remember the previous picture, the paint's exactly the same, the colors are exactly the same, the black going all the way up to the top of the airplane, that's the same. Literally the only difference in the British and the American airplanes externally was the American stars put on there over the roundels. I mean, they literally placed them on top of each other and then the American serial number in the back. But this is what the airplane would have looked like had it stayed with the Americans. Next slide. This is what a model B-24 looks like. You can see the short nose on it, which Diamond Lil had. And you see this airplane actually has bomb bays. Diamond Lil was built from the factory with bomb bays. It was a fully combat configured airplane. We've got the receipt and the paperwork where they changed the bomb shackles out to British single point style versus American single point style. It's a common misconception, once again, that this airplane came from the factory with no bomb bays, and that is just not true either. It was definitely a bomber, and had it not gone to be a training airplane for the British, it would have gone on to Europe and become a patrol aircraft with the shore patrol, which is what the rest of the B-24As that went to the British did. Next slide. So this is kind of the history of the airplane during the war. It was accepted by the RAF on the 17th of May of 41. It went to TWA at Kansas City on the 18th of June of 41. And we have the receipt where it was signed by TWA accepting it for the Brits. And then it went to the Eagle's Nest Training Center in Albuquerque. That happened sometime in late June, very early July. What they were doing there was the British needed multi-engine conversion training and celestial navigation training. That was, using the stars to shoot your course and all that kind of stuff. That's what the airplane was sent to TWA for, because they were running a couple of training schools around the country. They had a B-17 and a few other planes, but the British loaned them this airplane. And why they picked this particular one, Who knows? It was number 18 out of those 20 that were diverted to the British. For whatever reason, this airplane was picked and was going to be used as this trainer. On the 24th of July in 41, they landed the airplane and the right brake locked up and slewed the airplane sideways, collapsed the right gear, tore the bomb bays out of it, tore the belly and the nose up really bad. And in the report written by the guys who were in it, they actually say the words, the bomb bay doors were strewn along the dirt. So the airplane was still configured as a bomber at that point. The Consolidated Aircraft Corporation put in a bid for $80,000 to repair this airplane. And for whatever reason, we've got the bid paperwork, but for whatever reason, it was never taken up. In 1943, they actually canceled their bid. But the airplane was repaired and ferried back to Consolidated to San Diego, where it was built sometime around December of 1941. Next slide. And what they did there, the airplane was so torn up, it really needed a complete rebuild. And Consolidated, they talked to the British and said, can we just keep this airplane to make into a transport for factory use? And the British were fine with that because by this point, they really weren't happy with the LB-30s performance in Europe because they didn't have self-sealing fuel tanks and all this. So what they did to Diamond Lil was they took all the bomb bay structure out and they put in basically a canoe. You can see the panel laying on the ground there. That's what they put in where the bomb bay was and made it just one entire compartment. Next slide, please.
Let me ask you a question before you go off of this picture. If you go back a second. Mm-hmm. So sitting behind them, so that single tail B-24, what is it, PBY4 or something like that?
PB4Y, yeah.
Yeah, PB4Y. So that tail conversion was done in Oklahoma from what Tex Hill had remembered. But it looks like they may be doing that here too. Is this also San Diego?
Yeah, that is San Diego. It may be a plane that flew in there. I don't know. I don't really know much about the production of those.
Yeah, because they look like they're more complete than what you're talking about here. So is this Lil sitting here on the left?
I understand that this is Diamond Lil being built on the side there. There's no way to prove it, but that's what I have always been told. That's what it said on the back of the original picture.
Right. And basically that the canoe is the new bottom that they're putting in place
that's
of where
the new bottom, and you'll see that in the next picture. You'll see where they had to put that in. Okay, next slide. So you can see there at the bottom where they took the bomb bay out and they just put that entire structure in there, and that sealed up the bomb bays, and you can see the windows cut in there. And the reason they did this was Consolidated. They basically needed a company plane, not an executive transport, but they were looking at a way to get into the transport airplane business, but there was nowhere into bomber production, and they were still building seaplanes and stuff at the time. There was nowhere in their production to start a whole nother line of airplane. So they took a B-24 that was damaged and said, hey, let's test this idea. Next slide.
Well, just to add to this, it would make sense to me that is Diamond Lil because of the bottom that's being placed into it right there with that window configuration, which is what you see next.
Yeah, the fact that it's being done in San Diego really leans to the fact that it is Diamond Lil. 7, the actual cargo version of the B-24s, they were all built in Fort Worth. But this is what Diamond Lil looked like after they rebuilt it. And you'll notice it still has the short nose on it. That comes into play in a little bit. You notice the engine cowlings, you'll see that they're round. They're not the oblong, oval-shaped cowlings that most people associate with B-24s. The reason being is that the B-24A, being an early model airplane, it didn't have the turbos on it. And that's where that extra vent comes in on the side of the cowling of a standard model B-24. So a lot of people will tell you, that's a sign that it's not really a B-24. Well, no, that's right there is how it came out of the factory as far as the engine assembly goes. Next page. Or slide, I guess. Later on, they stripped the paint off, and this is Diamond Lil herself and Consolidated Haver, and you see it still has the short nose on it. The short nose, they knew, Isaac Ladden, who helped design the airplane, they knew when they put the short nose on it that they probably should have lengthened it because it caused CG problems, and the lengthening of the nose happened on the very next model B-24 after the A was built. So the only airplanes that ever had the short nose were the B-24As. Next slide. Okay, a lot of people think I thought it was a C-87. That's what they always say. It's a C-87, which is the specific cargo version. That's not true. What happened is you see here the prototype C-87 was a D model. There's the serial number, and it crashed in Arizona in 1942. It had the same basic damage that Diamond Lil did. I've heard it was torn up actually a little bit worse, but it's the same kind of damage. There's a consolidated letter that we have from September 42 talking about wanting this steady stream of transports to come out of Fort Worth. And when they get that going, they wanted to get 3 or 4 more A model B-24s, which weren't being utilized except as trainers, and turn those into cargo planes. And then it says here, this letter of 6 May of 43, the conversion of AM-927 into a transport has been the primary reason for the development of the C-87. In reality, Diamond Lil was not the prototype C-87. It never was a C-87. It was the prototype that inspired the prototype of the C-87. All 287 of the C-87s were all built here in Fort Worth. Diamond Lil was built, originally started as a B-24A, very quickly turned into an LB-30B, which is the British export version of the B-24, and that's all it's ever been. It has never been a C-87. It just kind of looks like one, but it's a very common misconception that it's what it was. Next slide. So this is what a real C-87 looks like. See, it's got the long nose on it and everything like that. And look at the engine cowlings. It has the oval engine cowlings like I was talking about on later model B-24s. Every C-87 ever built looked exactly like that when it rolled out of the factory. That's not what Diamond Lil looked like ever. Next slide. During the final war years, when they were really using it as a transport, they had acquired another B-24 or LB-30 at Consolidated that they converted into this same sort of airplane, except it was a long nose one. And they took the nose and the V windshield off of an RY-3, which is kind of a Navy version of a B-24. It has kind of like the PB-4Y. It's the long nose. And that entire cockpit section was grafted on the Diamond Lil at the factory. And that's why the airplane has the long nose and the windshield configuration that it has. The galley, the stove, icebox, you know, some of the interior was done. It was far from a fancy airplane. It was very much green canvas and that kind of thing. It had PBY type QECs. That's the quick engine change kit. What happened is the B-24A, being a very limited production airplane, it had the 1830 engine, which is the same as the same as the PBY Catalina and most C-47s. What they did was, since there were so few parts for the A model B-24, in order to make it maintainable easily, they just took PBY QECs and grafted them onto the firewall of Diamond Lil. So the only real difference in it is the position of the oil cooler. That's really the only difference in them. The being round and everything like that, that's standard for an A model B-24. But the cowlings and all that stuff off the airplane today were put on in 1945, and those are straight off of a PBY Catalina. And the order to proceed on that was done around the 1st of August of 45. Next slide. And that's what the airplane looked like in its final configuration during the war with the military. You see, it still has AM-927 printed on the tail fin instead of the original 40-23-66. The reason is the airplane still actually belongs to the British at this point. So that'll come into play here in a minute. Next slide.
But what you can see in this slide is that they've gone away. So the greenhouse canopy type is gone. Now they've got the sliding long windows that became much more kind of a trademark of the cockpit look of this airplane. So that was done really still during the war.
Yeah, this was done in 1945, right towards the end of the war. Okay. 11 October of 45, the British Aircraft Commission sent a letter to Consolidated at Consolidated's request saying that they could have the airplane. It was actually given to the Consolidated, so it belonged to the British the entire war. So not only is it not true that the British never accepted it, the British actually kept it the entire war. They just never operated the airplane. It was actually given officially to, and we have the paperwork proving it, given back to Consolidated as their own airplane at no cost. And it's interesting, of the 20 airplanes they bought, they received 19 of them. They never got an airplane to replace Diamond Lil. It was just kind of written off. On the 29th of November, they wrote a certification proposal for the CAA, the Civil Aeronautics Commission. It's kind of the predecessor of the FAA. And this was in an effort to get the B-24 certified as a civilian airplane to get into the transport market at the end of the war. Next slide.
This airplane never left the United States during the war.
As far as we can tell, it never did. It went back and forth from one factory location to another. And what it did, according to the logs, it would carry parts. And then it would pick up like a crew that had ferried an airplane. It'd pick up the ferry crew and bring them back to the factory. And then it went back and forth. But I think when it was released by Consolidated, it had like 13,000 hours on it. I mean, they flew it a whole lot. But here it is in its first civilian markings when it's went to Continental CAN. It's actually still registered to Consolidated at this point, but this is what it looked like when Continental CAN originally purchased the airplane. Next slide. And that's the bill of sale, and it doesn't say on there what they paid for it. But see up there, it says aircraft make is that third line on the left. It says LB-30. The airplane was still known as an LB-30 and not a B-24 again, due to the serial number being AM-927, because there was no Warbird movement in 1947. Nobody cared if it was a B-24 on paper or on data plate or whatever. It had an LB-30 data plate because it was built that way, and that's why it stayed like this. But this is the bill of sale for Continental CAN. Next slide. This is what it looked like while in operation with Continental CAN. Kind of the same as it did in the military, but at this point, it had a much more plush interior. Next
and
slide.
this is where it gets a little confusing as to how it ends up at Continental CAN. So what my dad always said, because my dad was familiar with the airplane really since 1945 on. I don't know why or how, because it really shouldn't have fit into his scope of work during the war. But he was really good friends with Lucius Clay. So Lucius Clay replaced Eisenhower as essentially a Supreme Allied Commander, but they called it something like Occupying Governor or something like that. And he was stationed in Berlin after the war. And Brad and I talked about this a little bit. What I'm guessing is that he had a C-87 assigned to him, an actual C-87, as his airplane. And what I'm guessing is that there was a C-87 that was a presidential airplane. At one point, Eleanor Roosevelt flew on that airplane, obviously. But then Averell Harriman, as the ambassador to Russia, had a C-87 that was separate from the presidential one. And I'm guessing that airplane might have ended up with Lucius Clay, and that Lucius Clay had I think he liked the C-87. And when he went over to work at Continental CAN, that may have been why he wanted to pick up something that, even though this was technically an LB-30, he thought of it as a C-87. What would you say, Brad? Is that a good guess? Something
that's as good as any as we can make. I think it's pretty reasonable. So, next slide. And this was, I don't have my glasses on. I can't remember what that was, to be quite honest. It was something, it was when they exported it to Mexico. This is when Continental CAN sold the airplane to PEMEX. And this is where they're saying that it's coming off of the civil registry. So that was in 1959, it looks like. So that's when the airplane was sold to Mexico.
Yeah. And so, and again, this is where my dad is involved with this airplane, because he is friends with Lucius Clay. Again, I'm not really sure where that connection came from, but they've been friends for a while. And Lucius Clay had called my dad and said, I think that it was Continental CAN was upgrading to a Jetstar. And so they wanted to sell their LB-30. And my dad was very good friends with the head of PEMEX at the time. And PEMEX was looking for a long-range executive aircraft. And so that's how that sale happened, because my dad was in the middle of having it go from Continental CAN to PEMEX.
Next slide. This is what the airplane looked like its last years with PEMEX. This is after it came to the CAF. This is in Brownwood, Texas in 1967. And that picture, I should have put that next after this next one, but this is what it looked like when the CAF bought it. You see it has kind of the bulbous nose on the end of it. That's a weather radar that was put into the airplane. If you look at the previous pictures, it doesn't have that kind of a bulb tip on the nose. It just has a standard round nose. So at this point, it was an executive airplane that the CAF had purchased.
So
next slide.
wait, before you leave here, so what you see, if you look at the left vertical stabilizer there, it still has the XC designation, the Mexican registration on it. So this is very shortly after, because it still has the Mexican registration numbers on it. This airplane in 1959, when it was transferred to PEMEX, at my dad's recommendation, it was sent to Oklahoma, and a new executive interior was put into it. Now, I don't know if they redid what Continental Can had already put into it, which it would be doubtful. I think they totally redid the interior of it. It was a beautiful executive interior of it, and that's why I was I was born in November of '59, so somewhere in January of 1960 is when I was a 6-week-old baby flying on the airplane, or maybe December, probably Christmas week, and flew from Mexico City to Acapulco on the airplane.
Okay, next slide. This right here, this is a letter to Lloyd Nolan, and this is in 1966, and this is from Vic Agatha, John's dad. If you see down there in the third paragraph, it says there's a beautiful C-87 located in Mexico, owned by PEMEX. And that's where the CAF first learned of the airplane, was from Vic Agatha. And you see, he calls it a C-87 too, because being a military guy, he would have seen the cargo version of the airplane, and LB-30 probably didn't mean anything to him. It just looked like a C-87. And so that's kind of where the confusion on the airplane, the first time it was confused, I guess, in CAF parlance. But that's the letter right there. That's the actual letter that introduced this airplane to the CAF. Next slide. And this is the agreement that the CAF made with PEMEX to buy the airplane. And John can speak to this here in just a second. He's got a better version, better story of it than I do, and better versions of the truth than me. The airplane, we paid money for it. I can't remember the exact purchase price, but we also agreed that when the airplane came to the U.S., we would give them back the 4 engines that were on it, because they still had a couple of C-47s at PEMEX, and they needed the engines. And the CAF, in true CAF style at the time, we knew we didn't have the money to pay for the engines. We didn't have the money to buy them. And I've got a letter from Lefty and Lloyd to some other supporters saying, if we ever take these engines off the airplane, it'll never fly again. But this is the agreement that we made to purchase the airplane and give the engines back. Next page.
Yeah. So what I think is happening here is that there is actually not much money being exchanged, even though they may be claiming there's money being exchanged. And the reason I think that my dad's involvement was very quiet about the whole thing is because more than likely what was happening is that one of the intelligence services, and this happened a lot, particularly the CIA, had a lot of airplanes, a whole lot of airplanes. So all the Bay of Pigs things had happened, and that really affected Fifi actually, because they were using A-26s that were CIA airplanes, and all of a sudden that affected a lot of bomber fleet type transports in the United States. There's big restrictions put on them. And what I'm guessing it happened here is that my dad had an arrangement through the U.S. Embassy in Mexico probably to exchange. I'm not sure about the engines, but there was a DC-6 that was involved in the exchange for Diamond Lil. My dad was always pretty cryptic about it. I know that he was right in the middle of the whole thing, because he was involved with it going to Continental Can, and Continental Can to PEMEX, and then from PEMEX to CAF. He knew that airplane for a long, long time. And truly, the CAF probably could not have afforded to buy this outright as an airplane, because it was a beautiful executive transport, probably still desirable by many corporations at that point. So whatever the finagling was that was being done there, there was probably some involvement in the U.S. government wanting to get it, make sure that it was affected.
Okay, next slide. When the CAF got the airplane, They sent the Mexican mechanics and the PEMEX crew back home with all their tools and crates and everything like that, and said they made a deal with them and said, we will get you some engines. And there's differing accounts on how this happened. I've got receipts and paperwork proving that the CAF went on a hunt for engines. And I think PEMEX eventually agreed to take 2 good engines and 2 overhauled, cores, 2 that could be overhauled. So still a total of 4 engines, but it was still, only 2 were good. But it was still more money than the CAF had. And so PEMEX kept the books and registration and paperwork for the airplane until the CAF managed to cough up the 4 engines. And they did this. 1 engine came from Oklahoma, 1 from California. They kind of cobbled them from around the country. And how exactly they got paid for is up for debate. It can be under nefarious circumstances. But either way, in the dark of night, a CAF crew went down to Mexico, down to the border, with a truck with 4 engines on it. And the PEMEX people met them at the border with a customs guy, and they traded the paperwork for the airplane for the truck with the engines. And that was in 1968. The CAF officially bought the airplane in 1967. And that's reflected in all of our paperwork. But if you look at the FAA paperwork and everything, and a lot of books and magazines that will say we got the airplane in 68, that's because that's when we finally were able to get the paperwork away from PEMEX and couldn't register the airplane prior to that. So you can see in this picture what they were doing. This was in 1968 is when this ad came out. They were going to the Dayton Air Show, and the CAF put out this little flyer in the Dispatch magazine, or the newsletter at the time, that said if you'd like to fly to Dayton, first come, first serve. And I think it was like $130 or something to ride round trip to Dayton, Ohio, and there was 12 seats in the plane or something like that. But this is what the airplane looked like. This is the interior that I know for certain is Diamond Lil. There are some other interior shots that I think are Diamond Lil, but I can't say for certain they are. That one I know is. And if you look in the picture to the left, you see Lefty Gardner there on the left side. And the panels all, equipped pretty nice. The airplane had radar, it had radios, all that kind of stuff. Within just a few years of coming to the CF, most of that stuff disappeared. The radios were all pulled out and put into the fighters and stuff like that. So the airplane kind of got neglected. It wasn't abused, but it kind of got treated badly to get the fighters going later on.
What's interesting about this picture, well, first of all, Lefty was a B-24 pilot during the war. So it makes sense that he'd be flying the airplane. The fellow sitting on the right sure looks like Van Skiles, but I can't speak to that being him. But this is the interior that I remember. And now that I look at the picture carefully, when I first saw this picture the other day when Brad sent it to me, I was like, yeah, but it doesn't have the panoramic window. So if you look at the picture above, under the wing, you see that long panoramic window with the 2 windows behind it, smaller windows. But if you look at this picture now that I'm looking at it, where if you look at the 2 forward seats, the club configuration seats, the 4 seats facing each other, that is the panoramic window. So this is the interior of what was the PEMEX interior of this airplane. It was a beautiful airplane. I mean, the interior was really first class. It was nice.
The joke by all the flight crews during the early years of operating this was it was so nice on the inside, they didn't know if they needed to be wearing flight suits or dinner jackets because it was such a nice airplane. They said you could have put a tuxedo on and felt at home in the airplane. Yeah. Next slide. So around 1972, when Transpo 72 was going to happen, which is a big transportation conference up in DC, the CAF was invited to bring their entire fleet up to DC and fly over the Potomac and fly over the Capitol and all that. And Fifi didn't get to go, but they made a very concerted effort to try to get Fifi's one-time flight restriction removed so that she could go. She wasn't able to, but and this is when the CAF first put authentic paint or military paint on their airplanes. And this is an ad for Charlie Day aircraft refinishers out of San Angelo. And Charlie painted all the original CAF airplanes. And this is what Diamond Lil looked like. You see it still has the radar nose there on the right. That's when the airplane was first painted in military markings. Next slide.
I went to Transpo 72. I was there for that. Charlie was a prince of a guy. I'll just add that. He was a neat guy. This picture of Fifi on the left, though, that is not 72. That's in 73. I mean, that's in 74. But Charlie is the guy that painted Fifi. But in 72, Fifi still didn't have a name yet. It wasn't named Fifi yet. And it still was what it looked like coming out of the desert in 69. But I do remember when they painted Diamond Lil.
Okay, next slide. And this is what Diamond Lil looked like for several years down in Harlingen. You know, and I said that the airplane wasn't really neglected. It just kind of suffered at the hands of some of the other planes. It was used as a spare parts source for a lot of the other airplanes that were really popular to fly. And part of the problem was no one really knew what it was. It was kind of a B-24, but it had this executive interior in it. And I've got a letter that a guy wrote to headquarters in 1976, I guess it was, where he was just madder than fire because he had paid $1 to tour the airplane. And he had flown B-24s during the war, and that was not a B-24. No B-24 he ever was in had a bar in it. And he was mad. And so the CAF, that's when they first said, we need to look at converting this back to a bomber. And it's a little known fact, and we would never admit to it today, but I'll tell the secret because I have the paperwork to back it up. The CAF tried a couple of different times early in Diamond Lil's career with the CAF. They tried a couple of different times to trade it for other airplanes that were flyable bomber configured airplanes. I have the letters that they wrote to the Air Force trying to trade this one for the D model that's on display at Dayton. They tried to trade it for the J model that is on display at the Pima Air Museum because that airplane had flown in from England. They made several attempts to get another plane. They were going to rebuild this for static for those museums, but they wanted an actual bomber, and they just didn't have it. Next slide. So that's what the airplane flew with. You see now it's got the bomber nose on it, and that's the original A model / D model style nose glass on it. The nose glass actually came from a man named David Talashay out in California. He had found a couple of B-24s that had been scrapped up in Canada, and they were put on train cars and brought back to California, to Barstow, and he was going to rebuild at least one flying D model out of there. Well, there was a mistake somehow, and the guys that unloaded the planes unloaded them on the side of the track where the scrapyard was. And so those two B-24s, they got scrapped. And about the only thing left was part of the nose, and that's for this nose glass cover. And the CF traded a P-38 nose for that nose. That's where Diamond Lil got that. Next slide. And that's the nose art. That's from 1978. That's pretty much the original nose art that was on it. There was about 3 or 4 different versions of it over the years, but it's a Alberto Vargas drawing from like 1966, I think it was. It appeared in Playboy magazine, and that's where that art actually came from. The name Diamond Lil. There was a movie, a play that turned into a movie called Mae West, was starring Mae West. And she was a madam in a house of ill repute in the Old West. And that's what the whole premise of the movie was. It was a musical, and her name was Diamond Lil. And there was also a country song about it called Darling Diamond Lil. That's where the name came from. She is not named after a prostitute. I've heard that story normal times. A movie prostitute, yes, but it wasn't named after anyone specific. It was apparently named after the movie character that Mae West played. Next slide. So before we get into this, John, is there anything you wanted to say about flying in the airplane back when it was in executive configuration?
So, I mean, not only was it the first airplane I ever flew in as a baby, and I'm not sure how my dad swung this because you were not supposed to fly in CAF airplanes unless you were at least 18 years old. But I remember flying in Fifi in 1973 to the air show that was at Dallas at Southwest, the airport. I don't even know if it exists anymore, but there was an airport called Southwest that was in between Dallas and Fort Worth. And CAF flew an air show there that Diamond Lil was part of, but I flew up there with my mom, and I had brought with me some Coca-Colas. And my mom had brought with her a case of rum that my dad would always hand out to all the CAF guys. That was this rum from Mexico that they all loved, Ron Castillo. And then there were 3 guys from the CAF that were just hopping a ride. They were not crew, and they had an ice chest. And so between the 3 of us, we all configured. And It's the first place I started drinking rum and cokes, and it's the first place I ever got drunk was on that airplane. I'm a little too young to be doing that, but I didn't know any better. So that was my last, first and last ride as kind of a conscious adult in that airplane with the executive configuration.
Yeah. In the over the years, Diamond Lil has had kind of ups and downs from a maintenance perspective. They had different times where you had crews that worked really hard on the airplane for a few years, then the money ran out, or they couldn't get air shows, or financial trouble or whatever. And then it would set for a few years, and then it would get back up and fly a few more years, and that happened quite a bit. And then finally in the 90s, it wound up mid to late 90s. It wound up in Tulsa with a group of CAF members and guys like Jim Gentry and Matt Olafson and Bob Prater and Shad Morris. They and a whole bunch of guys. They had a really good crew of most of American airline guys that really did a lot of work to this airplane. And a guy named Fred Kumpf is the guy who's kind of unknown in the CAF. I said at the beginning of this that I get to stand on the back of a lot of people who have done research. Well, Fred Kumpf went out to Consolidated their archives in San Diego, and he's the one who dug up the vast majority of the paperwork that proves where this airplane came from. The original bill of sale, which we had, the window sticker for the plane, we've got that. Fred Kumpf is the guy who dug this up, and no one had ever gone to the trouble to do that before. And that's why so many books were printed with just hearsay in them, because it wasn't until the mid to late 90s that anyone actually found out the truth. So we've had the airplane since 1997, and here it is, 2020. And every time I open another box of B-24 stuff, we learn something else about this airplane. How is it you can own an airplane for 50 years and still find something else about its history every day? But we do with this airplane. But the guys in Tulsa, they really did a lot of work to this airplane. It flew to the UK one summer and did a couple of air shows, and they really put a lot of work into it. And then over the years, we had the big engine problems with Fifi and everything, where we had to ground the airplane for 4 years. And Diamond Lil, being part of B-29, B-24 squadron, it was kind of up to Diamond Lil to really support us financially from an airshow perspective. So the decision was made as much as possible to convert the airplane back to its original bomber configuration. And a guy named Gary Austin was the crew chief at the time. And Gary is the one who, with some volunteers, but a lot of it was Gary and the High Sky Wing guys at Midland who did a lot of the fabric work and all. They're the ones that converted this airplane into what you see today. If you see there on the picture on the left, you see this B-24 being so early, it's not like B-24s that people think about. It doesn't have a gun tub, a big round gun turret in the back like the others do. It has a guy who sits in a canvas sling in that drawing right there, and he hangs out the back of the airplane with either one or two machine guns, depending on the configuration. Next slide. Well, Diamond Lil didn't have a gun tub in the back. It had a cargo pod on the back of the airplane. So Gary Austin, he had to figure out how to make a non-existent gun turret with hardly any drawings and very few pictures. And you see up there on the left, that's a Spanish-built Heinkel, the HU-111 Heinkel. The CF had a lot of spare parts for a Heinkel they used to own. And you see on the right, there's a damaged spinner. Well, we found that out on the hill, as we called it in Midland, there where all the spare parts were. And you see that had a big dent in it, so it was never going to be airworthy. The bottom part of the tail turret of Diamond Lil is actually a Heinkel spinner that Gary cut in half and then sectioned and beat it into position and ran it on an English wheel. And he built that gun tub from scratch, starting with a Heinkel spinner. So I like to put that slide in there so people know that's where that came from. That shows the genius that people like Gary Austin have to make something out of nothing. Next slide.
Gary was meticulous too. He wanted to make sure everything was as historically accurate as possible.
Yep. And you see, this is what the gun turret ended up being, and that is authentic for a model B-24. Next slide. The airplane didn't have a ball turret on the bottom like a lot of people think. Later model B-24s did, but even the first series of the D model still didn't have it. So Diamond Lil had a 50 cal that went in a socket and stuck out the bottom of the airplane. It was called a tunnel gun. And some of that structure was still there, but Gary had to build the entire door and everything, but the mounts were still there. So Gary constructed all of that from scratch with some help from some other volunteers. Next slide. And that's what it looks like from the bottom. And you can see Fifi over there in the background with the nose case off the engine. This is when we didn't have the money to fix the engines yet. We hadn't even started taking the old engines off. But that's when Gary put the gun back in the belly of it. Next slide.
I remember this because when I was in charge of redoing the engines for Fifi, I was always amazed at what he was doing with Diamond Lil, because he always had something going on with Diamond Lil.
And he did it with no money. We did it with no money. He did it with spare parts, that we found. One thing that we haven't ever gone back to is, if you look on the left side, right behind the wheel, you see that little ladder sticking down the belly? That's how you got into the A model B-24. Well, nowadays, people being a little bigger than your average 120-pound American, we knew that it wasn't practical for people to get in, and out of there. Well, the airplane had a cargo door cut into the side of it when it was converted. And that comes into play later. That's where the left waist window would have been originally, waist gun window. And all the control cables originally ran down the side of the airplane. All that was reconfigured when they put the cargo door to run over the top. So we knew that cargo door wouldn't work. So the next slide will show you kind of what we did.
And that door that you see on the right, that's the door that it had, probably even a consolidated, but it's definitely the PEMEX door. And then they had a little set of stairs that they would take with them that then they would put out, and that's what you walked out on.
Okay, next slide. That's what Gary did. He took that door and basically cut it by 3/4, and so now we have kind of an air stair door. As a result, we don't have the waist window on the left side where the waist gunner would be, but until we have the time and the money to completely reconfigure the control cables, which is a massive undertaking, we probably won't be able to ever undo this. Next slide.
And when Gary did this, and I saw what he was doing, I just said, I'm just shocked that in the corporate conversions of this airplane that somebody didn't think about doing that.
And you see the right waist window, the structure was still there. Gary just had to uncover it and find it. So now it has a waist gun on the right side. Next slide. This is the airplane that's in the Air Force Museum. This is a standard D model with the oval cowling and all that. But see where the top turret is right there behind the cockpit? That's what most people assume a top turret on the B-24 looks like. So next slide.
But I want you to notice too, see this airplane, if you go back a second, take a look at the top of that cockpit, and you see the greenhouse, all the glass that's up on top there. So Diamond Lil had that taken out long ago. I mean, probably during the war, right, Gary?
Yeah, during the war conversion it did. Next slide. You see in the drawing on the left, the gunner actually had an open ring like the tail gunner of an SPD Nautilus or a Helldiver, and he stood up there on a platform and fired through an open hole. And you see the hole is still in the airplane. The ring is still there, but the control cables ran through it. This is aft of the wing. So this airplane never had a top turret like people think. Next slide. And you can see in this picture with it circled, this is one of the sister ships that did go to the UK. You can see the gun sticking out of the top with no turret. Later on, the British did put a turret in there, and then eventually the turret moved up to the front where people, historically associated. Next slide. The Bombay doors. We do have about 80% of the stuff we need to put Bombay doors back in the airplanes. The external tracks are still there, hidden underneath the sheet metal. We've got the doors. We have bomb racks. The airplane actually has some racks in it. It could be done. It would be a major, major ordeal. You'd have to jig the airplane up and take that canoe back out and put a keel beam back in. It is possible. And if somebody wants to mail a check for $1 million to the squadron, we'd be happy to get the Bombays back in, but we could potentially do that. Next slide. When the airplane was finished, they kind of thought, let's rebrand it. And the plane never had a real name. They called it Old 927 during the war sometimes, but it never really had nose art or anything other than Diamond Lil. And since Diamond Lil wasn't historically accurate, they thought, well, let's just, for marketing, let's make another name. Let's name it something else. And this is really pushed a lot by Gary. And so they did it. That's where they took the nose art off in preparation for painting the plane. Next slide.
And what's happening at this time, exactly when this is happening, is that the Collings Foundation B-24 is coming online, and it's being rebranded several times. It was called the All-American, then Dragging the Tail, and I don't even know what it's called today, but that was the thinking as well. Maybe we need to rebrand and go to something else.
Yep. Next slide. This is when the airplane was painted back in British markings. Remember I said earlier that the black paint used to go all the way to the top? The reason that wasn't done is because it makes the airplane so much hotter. That's the reason they left the black all the way down at the bottom. Next slide. A very talented artist named Chad Hill came down and he painted the new name and nose art on the airplane, and it became Old 927. And this is when he was actually painting. Next slide.
Which I think Old 927 was a Gary Austin pull, wasn't it?
He's the one who really pushed it the hardest. There is some documentation where they refer to the airplane when Consolidated was operating it is Old 927. Well, I was in the Air Force for 20 years and flew most of my career, and we referred to all airplanes by their tail numbers unless they had, a specific name. So I don't think the airplane was never named Old 927 historically. They just called it that. But Gary and several other people thought that would be a good way to go with a new name for it and nose art.
What he told me was that he had seen some piece of paperwork when it was in San Diego being retrofitted or fixed up, that it was referred to as, oh yeah, we call that airplane Old 927. That's how he came up with it.
That was in a newspaper article in the company newspaper. I've got that somewhere here at the house that Gary gave me. So this is what the airplane looked like when it's finished, and we flew it like that for a couple of years. Next slide. And then in 2012, the squadron voted. I was in the vote when they did it. It was overwhelming. Not everyone voted for it, but it was overwhelmingly voted to go back to Diamond Lil. The reason being was that we were constantly faced with the question, where'd Diamond Lil go? What happened to Diamond Lil? And the airplane was famous for being Diamond Lil. Just like Fifi is not famous for being a B-29, specifically, it's famous for being Fifi. And same thing with Diamond Lil. Its history as a Warbird is what has made the airplane well known. So we went back to Diamond Lil, and Gary Velasco did the nose art, and it's a little updated from the original, but it looks very nice and it's been very successful. Next slide. And that's what the airplane looks like when we rolled it out the doors over here at Addison when it was kept here at the museum. We rolled it out and started touring the airplane and did so very successfully. It had a very good response from the public, and now we get a few questions every year. What happened to Old 927? Did someone sell it or what? The airplane will probably stay just like that in that configuration. As far as going back 100% like it left the factory, we could never go back to the short nose, even if we do have a short nose to do it with. But even if we could, we wouldn't do it because of the stability issues. The Bombay, it's $1 million job to do that, so it'll probably never happen. The airplane still struggles. It makes money, but it struggles to make as much money as it could because it's not a B-17, quite honestly. B-17s are so popular, and the poor B-24 still suffers in comparison. But Diamond Lil is an exceptional airplane, and the people that maintain it now, the volunteers in particular that really work hard on this airplane, they just bust their tails keeping it going. And even when they are met with problems that are difficult, and in this case today expensive because of the coronavirus canceling air shows and everything, they still find a way to do it. And so the airplane desperately needs an influx of cash. And so if anybody wants to send us a check, we're happy to take it and put it into the airplane.
Well, I'll make a couple of comments about the B-24 and why the post-war conservation of these airplanes versus the B-17. So the B-17 is a far easier airplane to fly than the B-24. I have a lot of respect for the guys that flew this airplane during the war when it was at max gross or beyond that. It's a tricky airplane to fly. I remember a long time ago when I was flying it, they said, well, this airplane really doesn't take off. It departs and it doesn't land, it arrives. because you're just not quite sure exactly as you're coming in. And it's had nose gear collapse issues in the past, and part of that I think is because it's a very hard airplane to put into a nose up configuration for landing. I mean, you can do it. It's a trick. And so the guys during the war that were doing it, go look at wartime footage of a B-24 departing anywhere, and you will see that it kind of goes up like an elevator. It doesn't really, it doesn't go up like a B-29. You definitely have rotation, and the airplane is nose up as it's going off. B-24 theoretically is supposed to do that, but it's a little trickier to do it. And that's probably one of the reasons why it didn't have quite the popularity after the war that a B-17 did, because the B-17 was just a far easier airplane to fly. Having said that, there's a lot of firsts that happen with B-24s, particularly at Willow Run for the Ford Motor Company, because they produced a boatload of these airplanes at Willow Run and discovered mass production techniques that were then transferred to the B-29, to Boeing. So that they would know how to do things, because Ford Motor Company was a mass production company. They knew how to do this.
Yeah.
And I do remember when this airplane transferred over to the B-29 squadron, it was struggling financially. And the truth is that it's been a great symbiotic relationship between Diamond Lil and Fifi, sometimes touring together, sometimes having to support each other when the other one was down, so that they would be both financially viable.
Okay. Next slide. And that's what she looks like today. And I guess, and if I had a couple final things to say about this, is what I want people to take and spread far and wide and tell whenever people cast aspersions on this airplane. It is not and never was a C-87. It was started as a B-24A, sold to the British and became a LB-30, flew that way, became a civilian airplane, and is kind of a cross between a B-24A and LB-30. But the number one thing to know is an LB-30 does not mean cargo version of the B-24 Liberator. LB-30 means nothing but British export designation for a B-24. No LB-30 came off of the factory floor as a cargo plane. It just happens that a few of them, including this one, were converted to cargo planes later on. LB-30 is nothing more than the export name for a B-24A. So anyone who tells you a B-24, it's not a B-24, it's a LB-30, they're just being a smart aleck and trying to prove they know more than you. At the end of the day, it is a B-24. Walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. And in this case, it really does waddle going down the taxiway.
There really, truly, there are not many models of B-24s, period, static ones, that you can go look at. The only one that I've ever been through that is actually fairly stock is owned by Kermit Weeks, that I think he got out of India, if I'm not mistaken. And it still has pretty much everything in it that came out of it with the war. I've seen the one that's in England. Obviously, the one that's at the Air Force Museum. There's just not a whole ton of them. They were destroyed.
Yep. You had 18,000 of these things built. There's 2 that fly. And then if you count Kermit Weeks' airplane, that's the 3rd one that could potentially fly again. But other than that, there will probably never, ever be another B-24 ever fly besides Diamond Lil and the Collins Foundation airplane. We're lucky to have it, and I hope we can fly it for a lot longer. Hope we can.